Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iva Caroli Lister, and I work for the GROW program at Rural CAP, Rural Alaska Community Action Program. And I'm based here in Anchorage, on Denina land. And I'm here with Lee Collins in Cordova, and he is the community garden coordinator at the community garden in Cordova, and he runs a really impressive community composting program there, which he's going to talk about today. And he has a presentation. So if you have questions, you can probably just like find a time to unmute or put it in the chat. We don't have a huge group. So yeah, I think we can just do questions as we go, and then we'll also have some time at the end. So yeah, I'll just pass it off to Lee now.
All right. Thank you, Iva. And yeah, thank you everyone for participating today. So as Iva said, my name is Lee Collins. I live in Cordova, Alaska, which is the ancestral lands of the Eyak people. And my role as a coordinator at the community garden is I help oversee some of, all the summertime growing work. And I help people get set up with their growing. And along with that is the composting operation that I run there. And it is a fairly unique system that I think everyone will find interesting. So with this presentation, I'm going to first talk a little bit about the origins of this compost tumbler, why it's in Cordova, and then speak a little bit of the experience that I've had since getting it operating again and the use of it and some things that I've learned in that process. So I'm going to share my screen and get a presentation going. So yeah, like Iva said, if there's you hear any breaks or good times, you can write questions in the comments or unmute and maybe ask a question if there's a certain slide you'd like more information on. Okay, so yes, this is a presentation on a little bit of a DIY composter, kind of specific to Alaska, and so I can reference this first image again after I talk some about it, and anybody who likes to look at it. But the very basics of it are, this is a tumbler style in-vessel composter with off to the left side in the farther distance, the round door is where compost is unloaded from, and the door we see closer on the right side, that's where material is loaded in to this tumbler. And the origins of this tumbler, the reason we have it in Cordova is the Copper River Watershed Project, which is a local nonprofit that works in maintaining or protecting and rebuilding fish habitat. And one of their projects, which went from 2003 to 2009, was to experiment with composting fish waste from local canneries. And this included, early in the spring, halibut, and going into the salmon fishing season, they would operate it through the summer by mixing fish waste and sawdust together. And yeah, that was their project. And it was, the interesting thing about it is it was constructed from, this was a pressure canner that came, I'm not sure which cannery or where exactly how it made it to Cordova, but it was used to can salmon. So it's 22 feet long and 4-foot diameter. So a little bit bigger than your typical home compost tumbler, which gives it a lot of advantages when it comes to actually speeding up the compost process. So in the spring of 2024 is when I was introduced to this tumbler. I had heard of it being in town, but not seen it, and got to go check out where it had been stored at since it was last operated. It took a little bit of, elbow grease here and there, but overall it just took some cleaning up, some maintaining of the small engine that runs it, and the thing was back in service. And I was able to move it down near the community garden, sort of on the opposite side of the property from where we actually garden at, and put it back into operation, doing food scraps which I collect through the community. And so where this compost goes is I use it for the community garden bed. So since it's been in operation, and even before when I was simply composting in piles, this compost, generally I use it as a mulch every winter to cover our garden beds, and use it to build new soil. I've also, a lot of it has gone to the school as they try and rebuild their beds that have existed at the school, and for any new gardening project at the school that they take on, this is available to them. And then in spring of 2025 was the first time that, as sort of a trial run, we tried selling compost to local gardeners. And so we did that sort of in a small, a small trial run. I wasn't doing a whole lot of advertising, but I was doing a lot of talking to local gardeners and figuring out if they'd be interested in trying it. And we had a lot of good, I got a lot of good reception from that. People were really excited, the idea that there was a local soil amendment made locally with stuff we already had here. So a lot of people were pretty happy to be able to try out using it. Okay, and so the next few slides are just going to be some photos. And so this one I like to start with because it gives a good picture of, for one, the whole size of the tumbler, and also some of the unique features about it being that, so it's mounted on a hay wagon, and it's driven by, it has, it's smaller trailer tires that it rests on. We can see around the middle of the tumbler, that is a chain, and that's what actually, you start up a small Honda engine and run it, and that's what actually drives this thing and drives the drum and makes it rotate. So we have both doors are open on it right now. What you see, the unloading door, that's an original piece of the pressure canner, just with vents cut in it, as it wouldn't have had any of these vents before it was modified for this use. So yeah, that's and just another thing I like to note in this picture was that, this is right on the edge of the property that we work on. So there's sort of just a drop off on the other side, but to try and utilize the small space we have really well, off to the right of the loading door, that is the sawdust pile, that's my primary carbon material is sawdust that I collect from local sawmills. And having that close to the loading side is really helpful when it comes to loading food waste or whatever material I'm adding to it, is to have your carbon source easy to access. And this shows a little closer the vents that have been cut into each end. So the picture on the left, that is on the side that we load into, just with the door closed. And so ventilation is definitely key in an in-vessel composter such as this, because otherwise it's just a steel drum. So having something to actually keep some airflow going through is really important, having them on both ends. Another modification that I had to make to this tumbler, it had several small holes drilled, where sitting in the main position it sits in is where the loading door is accessible, and it had some drain holes drilled in it, but adding a lot more of those was helpful because of just the amount of liquid that tends to pool in the bottom. Just having more of that liquid, leachate drain out easier, or have more places to drain out, definitely helped with reducing odors, and to just keep the compost drier. That's kind of the key in our climate, and most of coastal Alaska, is we have plenty of water, so compost, even in an in-vessel system like this, still can get wet, and so drainage is an important part of making good compost and just keeping it the right moisture levels. And so this one, we have a little bit closer look at the actual mechanism that drives the drum. And so we see here, this is the chain drive that we see as it kind of runs underneath the tumbler. And it's not the best picture because it's hard to get into there and see it. But this is this gearbox that was actually driving that chain. That's connected to a hydraulic motor by another chain. And that hydraulic motor is what's driven by the Honda engine. So for the operation of this, you start the Honda engine up, and then after the engine, is maybe warmed up a little bit, it can be revved up, and then you open a valve, and it slowly starts to turn that gearbox, which then rotates and pulls the chain on the tumbler. And so it's a really slow rotation depending on the speed you're running the engine. It's anywhere from 9 to a little over 12 minutes to do one full rotation. So it's definitely slow. And I think that's one of the things that's been really helpful for me in seeing a tumbler that actually operates well, compared to I've certainly used a home tumbler back in the day, and I used to throw scraps in it and I would give it a quick spin a couple of times and my materials would get clumpy. But this really slow rotation of this drum really helps the materials to just slowly fall down the pile and sort of roll along. And it doesn't really get clumpy. And I think it's good for aeration, which is the key again for the breakdown process and also for reducing odors. And this is just a closer look at these smaller trailer tires that actually not to drive, that actually the drum itself rests on. So there's 4 of these that support the drum itself. And this is what, allows it to rotate. And then, and then the larger tire that we just see the small corner of, that would be what, if it does need to be moved, that it's still trailer mounted, which has been pretty useful since this, how we were just able to move it down to the community garden. The mobility was pretty neat. We just had a truck tow it from one lot to the place we wanted to move it at. And then it's just, if we ever need to move it again, it's easily ready to just be hooked back up and moved again. We would probably completely unload it before towing it. That was the way it was moved before. And obviously all the weight of the compost in it could possibly have negative effects trying to drive down the road. So that would probably be one consideration, is we probably wouldn't move it loaded down with compost. And then these couple of pictures here just show kind of my process for loading materials into this tumbler. So on the left, this is one of my primary materials that goes into it, is the spent grains from our local brewery. And so generally when I collect, they have anywhere from 200 to 300 pounds of grains. And so what I do is, as I'm adding this material in, what we don't see in the picture, but you see the pitchfork leaning on the side of the tumbler. That pitchfork I use to throw sawdust into a more empty tote, and I sort of mix the sawdust in. And I would do the same process if I was adding food scraps. I would get them a little bit pre-mixed and then dump materials into the tumbler. One, because it's helpful to kind of have a lighter tote. Each of these totes of grains now weighs 50 to 70 pounds. And so I mix them in with some of the sawdust, but keep the totes light enough to where it's easier to load them in that door. And then the picture on the right, we see at the end, I generally try to mix around 2 to 1 at this stage, 2 to 1 sawdust or any bulking material, whether that's sawdust or shredded cardboard or other carbon material that I might be using, around 2 to 1 at that stage. And then generally, once I get all the material in there, I try to do a little bit of a layer of sawdust and shredded cardboard over the top. And in this case, in these garbage bags that you see in one of the totes, that's actually shredded cardboard that I just use a heavy duty paper shredder to shred up just brown cardboard. And that I like to add in with the grains, as they're fairly wet. And I like to have a dry carbon material to kind of soak up some of that moisture when they go in. And then so after I would add materials like this, I would generally run the tumbler just to get them more thoroughly mixed in with the pile. Oftentimes I would just do one rotation, like in this case, you can see the snow on the ground. So it is winter and it's cold. One rotation kind of helps to mix the materials in, but not expose so much of the material in the tumbler to too much cold air, that I find that I can keep the heat higher in the tumbler. Whereas if I was adding more material and it was summertime, I might do 2 or 3 rotations to get more airflow through the pile. And so this is a look at the tumbler from the unloading door, where I'm going to take materials out at. And so this is, the door where I load into is open. And so that's why you kind of see some sunlight shining in there. But if it's hard to see, but you can see how I think this was probably at a time when I'd added brewery grains, or possibly it was just food waste. But so there's more material. As you add material to your loading side, you increase the height of the pile, just the amount of material in that side. And that's really what helps it. All this, everything we see here is just sort of from the rotation of the drum has worked its way to the discharge side. Um, and so that's the key is you load materials in and then you kind of manage that, the discharge side, by making sure you're always pulling some materials out so that there's less volume of material on your discharge side, which keeps everything in the tumbler wanting to work one way or the other. And in the design of this tumbler, I believe it was designed with around a 5-degree incline from where you load, the side that you load materials on, to the side that you take it out of. But that's dependent on where it's parked. So we didn't exactly have level ground to park it on. So currently the way it's sitting, the drum's mainly level. It maybe tilts a little bit to the loading side, but even with that tilt in that direction, just by adding material to the loading side and constantly be unloading materials from this side, you keep that material wanting to work its way to kind of always level itself out in the drum. And then this picture kind of shows too just how broken down everything is by the time it's on this side. We can see that there's definitely still some woody bits. A lot of the sawdust that I collect is longer pieces of sawdust. So they take more time to break down, and they generally need to, in the curing process is where we see more of those disappear. But generally I see very little food waste on this side, unless it's like, if there happened to be like an apple, just anything round, maybe a lemon that, I didn't break up or maybe missed when I was getting it in the tumbler to break it apart. Sometimes those pieces make it down undecomposed, but generally, even by the time I find them on this side, they're partially decomposed and soft. And so anytime I pull materials out of here, I sift it lightly and check for anything that is not broken down, and that I simply take back in a bucket and dump back in so it gets a second pass through the vessel. And so then this is sort of a picture of what it looks more like from on the loading side. If I'm doing food waste, this would have been after, I loaded materials in and then was going to rotate it to get things mixed in. And so I also wanted this to the next few slides to kind of highlight some of the challenges of operating this in the winter, because since I've had it going in 2024, I have kept it operating all year round. And the main challenge, obviously, is, and one would expect, is that freezing weather that we get in this state. That because this is a steel tumbler, obviously there's no insulation to it, and steel conducts cold or heat very well, that it does get pretty cold, and the coldest weather we get in winter, and I do definitely have issues with the compost freezing. Generally, I can keep some heat going on this active end, when I'm always loading materials to, the pile will never fully freeze because there's always some of those microbes, that want to stay active enough that they're keeping some heat on the interior of the pile. The bigger issue is as it feeds down, it starts to lose its heat, where the freezing can cause more of an issue. And that's what this next image will show. And so this was Cordova. We generally have a pretty mild winter, but this was a cold snap of around 3 weeks, where I think it stayed around 0 degrees. It went slightly into the negative some. I know for many people in the state that doesn't seem like cold temperatures, but for coastal Alaska, we're pretty chilly then. But that was the issue, is as this compost moved down, this is on the discharge side, where it just was so frozen to the drum and just kind of broken into big chunks, that this picture looks like this because I tried to run it like this just to see what the material would do, and it kind of just started breaking up because I still needed to try to unload some materials so that I could keep putting more in. And so that, I think, is something to be said for a design like this, is that it's probably much more suited for coastal Alaska, where more mild temperatures, it's able to operate, about the same. If you were experiencing too much cold weather, if you were down into the negatives for weeks at a time, I don't know that you could keep something like this in operation. I think there's too many, because it's raised off the ground and because it's steel without insulation. You're just, once the material freezes, it would be hard to get it unfrozen. So yeah, I think for it's works well and for mild winters, for this cold weather that we do get occasionally, it does make it hard to operate. And so this was one of my solutions during that same cold snap from that image where it was all frozen. So we were having some sunny weather and we get decent sun at this site. And so with a black tarp, I thought it would absorb maybe a little bit of that heat from the sun. And then what can't see in the picture, but in front of the green bucket and underneath that tarp, I actually put just a really small butane heater. It was actually a camping jet boil. And I tried to see if using that running that underneath while trapping the heat with the tarp would help to thaw things out just a little bit. It wasn't real successful, but that was obviously a really small heater too. I think this method with a larger propane heater, maybe of some kind, it could be thawed out better. Really what happened was our weather just went back to our more typical Cordova coastal weather, which was, it warmed up enough where it was raining. And that's really what just those higher temperatures allowed the tumbler to thaw out some and to get that microbial activity started back up. And eventually it did thaw out, but it was challenging for a while to keep material going into it. And then after this is the stage after I get materials out of the drum. And so obviously we don't have finished compost at that point. We have generally all the food waste is gone, broken down, all the grains, all the nitrogen material are gone at that point. But then they still need a curing process. And so that's where this is located close to the drum. I have 2 stick and tarp setups like this where I just simply pile the material. I unload it from the tumbler, either unload it into small totes or buckets and just carry them, or there isn't the height of the tumbler is just up enough that a wheelbarrow barely fits under the discharge end, where I can pull material right into a wheelbarrow, dump into a curing pile, where I generally just leave it covered until it finishes. And that is generally the best way to do it here in Cordova. We just get so much rain that just the wind and the rain blows enough water on these piles to keep them moist. And for all our wind and rainy storms, plenty of times this tarp will blow off the top as well. So I'll oftentimes come back and there's no tarp on it. It's thoroughly saturated. Then I just put a cover back on and mix it up some to make sure it's not too wet. But this curing process has been working well for me in Cordova. Okay, and so now here I have an image that's definitely not Cordova. You can tell by the exotic plant. What I wanted to finish with was more just a talk on, for everybody, to think about things that might be able to recreate something like this in your community. And, some of you might be from coastal communities where there are salmon canneries or other fish processors, where you might find a canner, a piece of steel like that could simply be set up in a way similar to that, or in a different way, to make a tumbler. Other things that I think of specifically for Cordova is we see a lot of these either metal or plastic 55-gallon drums. And the reason I selected this picture of it, showing the drum in a less conventional arrangement, generally when you see someone make a tumbler, they keep it where it runs in a round direction. I selected an image like this just for an example to think of. It wouldn't even have to be a drum. We tend to think that a tumbler should be round, I think, but a tumbler still works if it's set up in this orientation with the long way where it tumbles. And this could even be done with with an insulated fish tote. That's another thing that I see in this town, that they get a little bit damaged by the canneries and they don't want to keep using them. Maybe they're not safe for them to forklift once they're damaged. But if you have an insulated fish tote with a lid, it could also, you would need a much heavier duty frame than this, but you could turn that into some sort of tumbler by simply mounting it onto a heavy duty frame, some sort of a chain drive or a belt drive to run it. And I think that there's so many different possibilities that if we all think about it in our communities, what could be used that we already have in the community to set up some sort of a system like this. And that's what, I think I'd like people to leave with here today. And I think my final. So, yeah, other than that, there's just a shot of some of my nearing finished compost with a little happy worm in it. So at this point, I cannot answer any questions, or I can go back through any slides if anybody wants to take another look at something.
Oh, yeah, I have two questions. One, what's the cost to keep the generator going? I mean, I have a little Honda engine, but just I'm curious, like over time, to pay for gas to keep that going. And then the other question is the bear issue.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I did actually. I was going to touch on the bear issue earlier, and the reason, so the reason I'm even able to operate this at the community garden is because it's a steel drum, one door, the unloading door bolts closed. The door that I load into is simply shut with ratchet straps. But once it's all closed up, there's just no way for a bear to get into this tumbler, and that's the other reason it's so ideal with its setup is that there isn't access for a bear. I think the main thing is just running it often enough to reduce odors. On top of that, and then as far as the cost of operating this, I really don't have to use very much fuel for this. It's about I think it's a 5 horsepower Honda gas engine to drive the hydraulics with around a 1 gallon gas tank on it. But I generally run it 2 to 3 times a week, more like 2 times a week. I guess I would say 1 to 2 rotations. So that's generally running 20 minutes at a time. But I have a 5 gallon can of gas from late fall, and that's still what I'm using for fuel. It's very fuel efficient. It's not burning a lot of fuel to run this, and so I would say 5 gallons probably gets you maybe not quite 6 months of operation, but it gets pretty close to that, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Lee. We have some questions in the chat. Jared's asking, well, I'll turn my video on. Jared's asking, are there certain materials that you do not want in your compost tumbler? And if so, how do you keep them out of your system?
Well, let's see, certain materials I don't want. The main thing that I would say that I don't want that I oftentimes find myself picking out is produce stickers. I mean, I think anybody who composts, especially if they've collected from grocery stores, we develop a certain relationship with produce stickers. That's not a great one. But as far as, I don't know if you mean like actual organic materials that I'm trying to keep out, but I guess, and I also was going to state this talking about adding materials. So all the inputs for this tumbler are I collect coffee grounds from a coffee shop, those spent grains. I occasionally get spoiled grocery store produce, and then our school cafeteria and hospital cafeteria both offer me food scraps, and all that stuff goes in. It's all great stuff that I want. But I guess as far as the only thing is, if there's produce stickers, if there's other plastics that happen to make their way in, I can generally find those as I'm sifting the materials out. But the main thing is try to keep them out in the first place. Like as I dump a tote, say, of the food with the chopped up veggie scraps that I get from the school cafeteria, I will find stickers still on it, sometimes a rubber band, not often, but that's the main thing, is just checking the materials as they go in.
What about meat and fat?
So I haven't been doing any meat, dairy, or fats. So the school cafeteria and our hospital cafeteria just save me vegetable and fruit parts right now. I do think that because I can keep the temperatures high on this tumbler, that I feel like I could safely do it, but it's not something that I want to quite venture to just yet until we spend more time just doing the materials that I know are safe to do.
Totally. Jonathan asks, what are your average temps in the vessel? And do you know what the dwell time is above the 131-degree target?
Yeah, so I do have, I have a 3 foot compost probe, which I generally just check the active end. It stays in, it sticks through the vent and I check it. And I generally in winter time, I can still get temperatures around 100 to 110 degrees. Um, Summertime, I definitely can easily get above that 131. I've seen temperatures go as high as 145. And then that's just a sign that I'm going to run the tumbler if I see it continuing like that. And oftentimes in the summer, I'm running it more often just because I see those temperatures climbing up and I don't want it to get too hot, but obviously, keep the temperature up as well. But generally am able to hit that target of that 130 degrees I can keep it up there for around 3 days. And that's one of my reasons for trying to run the tumbler twice a week is that I like to add the materials, hopefully see that temperature get back up. And what I have found what I do more often is it's hard to reach far enough into the drum as I don't have like any other access points other than the loading door. But I find that the temperature in the middle of the compost, if you're looking at the whole 22-foot drum, is generally a little bit hotter than the temperature that I'm finding right by checking it right on the end.
Nice. Emily is asking how much waste is diverted, just an estimate, and then do you think it meets the needs of the community or could you use even more?
Yeah, I tend to go from week to week thinking sometimes I want more, sometimes I feel like there is a limit to, how much I feel like you can process with a system like this. So on average, I'm probably collecting anywhere from 300 to 400 pounds a week. And that generally has a lot to do with, 200 to 300 pounds of spent grains, which if they brew every week, which generally they do, oftentimes they'll take a 2 week break sometimes. But I think it's meeting the needs of the community. I do want to keep expanding the operation here. And one of the ways I'm doing that is as I'm kind of slowly working with individual households. I currently have 4 households that will drop off a bucket of their food scraps. And I'm kind of slowly working into that with people who, I know are composting well, who are, not going to be giving me, first off, contaminated stuff, but also that they're clear on not adding meats and dairy into it just yet. But that is my goal, is to be able to expand the household contribution.
Nice. And then Savannah is asking about, and I'm sorry if you already said this, how long is the curing stage? I don't think you did. And how do you go about collecting food scraps throughout the community? And you kind of touched on that, but
Yeah, I can. I didn't talk much about the curing stage, and it's definitely dependent on the time of year. I think over summer, if we have a little bit warmer temperatures, I think the compost, like what I was started selling this past spring, was cured over throughout the whole winter. Most of that probably had more than 6 months of sitting in a pile, and that was after it spent probably around 4 weeks doing it, going through the tumbler in that time. But yeah, it just is really dependent on, like, right now our temperatures are, hovering right around 32 degrees and it's raining. And so what I'm taking out now might kind of be cured by springtime, but it's weather dependent, and warm weather definitely helps that speed up that curing process. So I guess I would say anywhere from 4 months to up to a year to actually get good finished compost where that sawdust woody material is broken down. Yeah, and then as far as, I guess, just because I don't know if I did talk about collecting from the community. So yeah, I do have households that they do drop their food scraps off, and I have a separate tote where scraps get dropped off into. But I do the collecting from the rest of from the other businesses and the schools. So I just pick up. and I'm developing good relationships with them to help them set up better systems, like make sure they have buckets that I can just grab from them, dump into totes, which I'm bringing with me, and then yeah, so I do the collecting of those materials.
And that's mainly from the school and the brewery. And then was there any other institutions that you collect from?
Yeah. So our local hospital, which is the Cordova Community Medical Center, they do a senior lunch program 7 days a week. So they had their cafeteria produces usually around as much, sometimes a little bit more in food scraps than the school does. But they save all of their fruit and veggie trimmings for me and any salad material that goes bad. But then also a local coffee shop. And from them, I'm generally able to get at least one full 5 gallon bucket of coffee grounds per week. During the summer, it's usually more like two buckets per week.
Is it hard to get people on board with this, or like are people like is there an incentive, or are they just kind of like excited about compost?
Yeah, generally it's just the people. The reason I'm collecting from who I'm collecting from is that they're excited to make less waste. I haven't, you know, the man at Sandy, who's the manager of the school cafeteria, used to try to compost on her own. They have some old fish totes behind the school, but it got to be too much work for them. So she's just really happy to be able to save up their scraps, and they generally produce 4 to 5 buckets a week. I collect from them once a week. So yeah, generally it's just that these people are also interested in just diverting some waste and having a use for their food scraps instead of sending them to the landfill.
Yeah. Okay, Barb is asking, is there a risk of reducing the nutrients if it overheats for long periods? And then also, what are we looking for in a finished product?
Okay, so yeah, I'm sure there's probably even people on this call with more knowledge than me as far as answering that first question. But as far as I know, the reason we're trying to keep our compost and we want to get it above that, 130-degree threshold for killing off pathogens and essentially the bad guy bacteria that we don't want. The reason we wouldn't want to see it getting up to 145, 150 or more for too long is that's where, the fungal, we're kind of balancing bacterial and fungal activity to break down our waste. And generally the fungal microbes do not survive at those higher temperatures. So it would be robbing our compost of a lot of beneficials by letting it get too hot. And then as far as in a finished compost, I just think of that as I want to be able to, after my pile's been curing, let's say I let it cure for 6 months, I want to be able to take a shovel or a pitchfork, dig into it, and generally find, I'm usually seeing some worms because these piles are on the ground, so earthworms find their way up into it. But mainly I want to grab that. I want to, maybe take a squeeze of it to see that it's not too dry and not too soaking wet. Make sure it doesn't smell too foul, but mainly I want to see everything broken down. If I pull that out and I still see fairly visible pieces of sawdust, bigger pieces of wood, then that just means it needs more time to get that fungal. The fungus, I think, are our main microbes that are breaking down the woody parts of the material, and they would just need more time to work on that pile and get it broken down. Where there's not the issue with having sawdust or any woody material not fully broken down, if you try to put that on a garden bed, you're really going to tie up your nitrogen in that process instead of having that nitrogen available to plants. Okay, and so for the question about rotating buckets, so I don't offer buckets to these businesses that do it. So the school cafeteria, they simply have their own buckets that at one point, I'm guessing different types of food have come to them. And I simply dump them into a tote of mine, give them back to them, and then they wash those and reuse them. Yeah, the issue, I love the idea of being able to, expand into having more of a collection service where they're given buckets or totes. We pick them up, we give them a fresh one. But I don't have a water source year round at the garden site. It's all just, we have our catchment system off of a roof for the summertime for watering our plants. But so for wintertime, I don't really have a way to wash containers. And so it's a little bit of extra work. I do, bring my totes to the brewery when we load up grains, but I will take those totes then to a family warehouse of mine where they just get cleaned. Or if it's raining, I'll leave them under a drip line for a bit to rinse them out and then bring them inside to dry. But yeah, I think that's always something to be looking at is improving improved collection, even from homes as well. I think I could get more people to be interested in composting if there was a clean bucket system, or even just paper bags for lining 5-gallon buckets. Oh yeah, using soil to wipe your buckets out. That's one that I've used too. I will use the snow if it's down there when I'm wiping out a container. But yeah, any material that I can use to wipe out the other material, and then hopefully have some way to rinse it.